Good evening. This is Trish, Thomas-Mink. I want to tell you another Cold War story. It's about the death of Robert Maxwell. I have become engrossed with the secret antics of the Cold War in any 20th century history. I know it's not real ancient history, but it was a fascinating 100-year period. This is about Ian Robert Maxwell. He was born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hawk. He was a flamboyant, larger-than-life character in Britain's publishing world, as he was the owner of the Daily Mirror. He was a man that ate too much, drank too much, didn't take care of his health, and took all kinds of medications. So at 67, he was rather sickly. But his life and disappearance in November 1991 is right up there with whatever happened to Jimmy Hoffa. After his disappearance, or his death, quote unquote, much was discovered about Robert Maxwell that was even more enlightening. He was born in Czechoslovakia, and he escaped Nazi occupation during World War II, though his parents were not so lucky. They were peasant Jews that died at Auschwitz during the war. Maxwell joined the British Army, and by 1945 he had earned the rank of captain in the army. He ended up in Berlin as the head of the Foreign Press Office, so he was well positioned to cut through a lot of red tape and to make things happen. He garnered much attention after World War II by smuggling aircraft parts into Israel. This led them to having supremacy in the air and helped them to win their independence in 1948. That was the beginning of his rise to notoriety. In the 1950s, he purchased Pergamon Press. This began his sort of meteoric rise as a publishing mogul. And in the 1960s, he was elected to Parliament. Then he was re-elected a second time for the Labour Party in Buckingham. In 1984, he purchased the British printing company Mirror Group newspapers. He had a life right out of Robin Leach's Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Maxwell often flew in from Oxford in his helicopter to go to work. He also frequently sailed on his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. He was constantly suing somebody and constantly involved with some sort of controversy. Now, Maxwell purchased the Mirror Group Publishing for $113 million. This included the Daily Mirror. Then he purchased Sinclair Research. And as the 1980s moved along, it saw him acquiring companies and building his empire. He was doing this using pension funds from his own companies. He was also getting into financial trouble, cannibalizing his organizations, and the British government was taking note. Bob Maxwell knew that he was in irreversible trouble in his business affairs. His once great empire was sort of collapsing around him at this point, except for the still profitable Mirror Group newspapers. Tabloids are always read, love 'em or hate 'em. His American acquisitions were a crushing debt burden. He had devoured the entire pension funds of the Maxwell Communications trying to erase the debt burden, and he mortgaged virtually all of his wealth on a huge gamble with fate. So when he was reported missing from his extravagant yacht, Lady Ghislaine, on November 5th, 1991, there were many questions about what happened to Bob Maxwell. Did he have a heart attack and fall overboard? Did he commit suicide to escape his crumbling empire? When they pulled his body from the Atlantic Ocean around the Canary Islands, more would be revealed about the life and death of Robert Maxwell. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Carlos Lopez de Lamela. Dr. Lamela said in a telephone interview that the Spanish autopsy team found that Mr. Maxwell had chronic lung disease and a heart ailment, including severe narrowing of the arteries. that would be listed as a contributing to the death along with drowning. That's what they were going to label his death, drowning. We are saying that he probably died of ischemic heart disease, Dr. Lopez said. He was describing a condition in which not enough oxygen-rich blood reaches the heart. Even though later detailed studies around his body performed in Madrid found no proof of a heart attack. They also produced no evidence of poison, alcohol, or significant doses of medicines. There was no significant amount of water in his lungs either, so it appears he hit the water dead. The truth is this: the family identified the body, and the forensic team took it at face value. Though they believe his heart and lung issues contributed to his death, there was forensically no real indicators of a heart attack. The forensic team could not rule out suicide, though his family said it would have been out of character. So, what killed Robert Maxwell? And here is where the real story begins to get interesting. Many believe it was the Mossad. Over the years, Maxwell had built up an impressive amount of powerful foreign contacts. He had many commercial contacts with Eastern Europe. He also passed communist information about the Soviets to the West. He had powerful ties to the Israeli government, and at the end of his life was believed to be passing information to Israel. Martin Dillion spent years researching Maxwell's life and wrote the book The Assassination of Robert Maxwell, Israel's Superspy. He and Gordon Thomas uncovered information that depicted Robert Maxwell as a spy for the Mossad, especially the last 6 years of his life. Now, in his personal life, many called him a monster at times. He threatened many around him. He threatened his wife, he threatened his children, the staff, his paper, and most erroneously, he threatened the Mossad. There was evidence that he tried to blackmail Israel for $400 million to save his failing empire. His list of accomplishments that would enable him to do this were astounding. I'm going to read you some of these. He had free access to Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Eastern Europe, and the Kremlin. He taught crime families of Eastern Europe to funnel their wealth from drugs, arms smuggling, and prostitution to banks and safe havens around the world. He passed on secrets he learned to the Mossad and Israel, and they tolerated for years all of his excesses. He told his Mossad handlers who they should target and how. He also set himself up as an ambassador to the Soviet bloc. Mossad stole from the U.S. an important piece of software. Now, I'm going to pronounce it probably wrong, so I'll spell it. It's called the Promise, or the Promise. So it's Promis, and Maxwell was to market it. Mossad reconstructed the software and put it in a device that allowed them to track any use the buyer made. Mossad would track all intelligence agencies from home base in Israel. Now, Maxwell sold it to 42 different countries. He also sold it to Los Alamos in New Mexico. And do you know what they made there? They made the atomic bomb in Los Alamos. Remember, this is a man who was taken into the bosom of the KGB leader, Kryukov. Kryukov wanted Maxwell to help overthrow Mikhail Gorbachev and put Russia back as a communist nation. For that, Maxwell's $400 million debt would be erased. Israel would go to the U.S. and persuade them to put Russia back to its communist roots during the Cold War. The KGB chief wanted Maxwell to use the Lady Ghislaine, named after Maxwell's daughter, as a meeting place between the Russian plotters, Mossad chiefs, and Israel's top politicians. Mossad set about planning Maxwell's murder instead. Now, he was taking Halcyon and Xanax. That with a couple of drinks made him very pliable. An electronic net was cast over his ship, and the security cameras shut off. So there was no record and no communication with the outside world. It is rumored that after he met with Mossad, they injected him with some drug behind the ear, and it was over. The flamboyant, luxury-loving Robert Maxwell was no longer a threat to Israel, Mossad, or any other country whose secrets he had been holding. He was dead, and his body was dumped overboard. When he was discovered, there was so much speculation as to what had killed him, but as I said, much of the evidence did not neatly fit into categories. Before Maxwell died, Eri Ben Menashe, former employee of the Israel Military Intelligence Directorate, came forward to the U.S. and Great Britain news agency proclaiming Maxwell was Mossad. His death caused panic with the banks he owned. Maxwell had used millions of pounds from his own companies to shore up the shares of the Mirror Group and to save his companies from bankruptcy. Shearson, Lehman, and Goldman Sachs put back the money into the pension funds. His death is still a mystery. There are some who believe the body they fished out of the sea was not Maxwell's and that he lives on somewhere out of Mossad's reach. His life was a story that movies are written around.